The South Defends Its Heritage by John Crowe Ransom. Originally published in Harper's, issue 159, June 1929. It is out of fashion in these days to look backward rather than forward, and about the only American given commonly to this disgraceful conduct is some unreconstructed Southerner, who persists in his regard for a certain terrain, a certain history, and a certain inherited way of living. He is punished as his crime deserves. He feels himself in the American scene as an anachronism, and knows he is felt by his neighbors as a reproach. Fortunately, he is a tolerably harmless reproach. He is like some quaint local character of eccentric but fixed principles, who is thoroughly and almost pridefully accepted by the village as a rare exhibit of the antique kind. His position is secure from the interference of the police, but it is of a rather ambiguous dignity. I wish that he were not so entirely taken for granted, and that as a reproach he might bear a barb and inflict a sting. His fierce devotion is to a lost cause, but I am grieved that his contemporaries are so sure it is lost. They are so far from fearing him and his example that they, even in the excess of confidence, offer him a little honor, a little petting. As a Southerner, I have observed this indulgence, and I try to be grateful. Obviously, it does not constitute a danger to the Republic. Distinctly, it is not treasonable. They are good enough to attribute a sort of glamour to Southern life, as it is defined for them in the popular tradition. They like to use the South as the nearest available locus for their scenes of their sentimental songs, and sometimes they send their daughters to the Southern seminaries. Not too much is to be made, of course, of this last graceful gesture, for they do not expose to this hazard their sons, who, in our still very masculine order, will have to discharge the functions of citizenship, and who must accordingly be sternly educated in the principles of progress at progressive institutions of learning. But it does not seem to make so much difference what principles of a general character the young women acquire, since they are not likely to be impaired by principles in their peculiar functions, such as virtue and the domestic duties. And so, at suitable seasons, and on the main line trains, one may see them in some numbers, flying south or flying north like migratory birds, and one may wonder to what extent their philosophy of life will be affected by 2 or 3 years in the South. One must remember that probably their parents have already made this calculation and are prepared to answer. Not much. The Southerner must know, and in fact he does very well know, that his antique conservatism does not exert a large influence against the American progressivist doctrine. The Southern idea today is down, and the progressive or American idea is up. Nevertheless, the historian and the philosopher, who take views that are thought to be respectively longer and deeper than most, may very well reverse this order, and find that the Southern idea, rather than the American, has in its favor the authority of example and the approval of theory. And some prophet may even find it possible to expect that it may yet rise again. I will propose a thesis which seems to have about as much cogency as generalizations usually have. The South is unique on this continent for having founded and defended a culture which was according to the European principles of culture, and the European principles had better look to the South if they are to be perpetuated in this country. The nearest of the European cultures which we could examine is that of England, and this is, of course, the right one in the case, quite aside from our convenience. England was actually the model employed by the South, insofar as Southern culture was not quite indigenous. And there is in the South even today an Anglophile sentiment quite anomalous in the American scene. England differs from America doubtless in several respects, but most notably in the fact that England did her pioneering an indefinite number of centuries ago, did it well enough, and has been living pretty tranquilly on her establishment ever since, with infrequent upheavals and replacements. The customs and institutions of England seem to the American observer very fixed and ancient. There is no doubt that the English tradition expresses itself in many more or less intangible ways, but it expresses itself, most importantly, in a material establishment. And by this I mean the stable economic system by which Englishmen are content to take their livelihood from the physical environment. The chief concern of England's half mythical pioneers, as with pioneers anywhere, was with finding the way to make a living. Evidently, they found it, but fortunately, the methods they worked out proved transmissible, proved, in fact, the main reliance of the succeeding generations. The pioneers explored the soil, determined what concessions it might reasonably be expected to make them, housed themselves, developed all their necessary trades, and arrived by painful experiment at 1,000 satisfactory recipes by which they might secure their material necessities. Their descendants have had the good sense to consider that this establishment was good enough for them. They have elected to live their comparatively easy and routine lives in accordance with the tradition which they inherited, and they have consequently enjoyed a leisure, a security, and an intellectual freedom that were never the portion of pioneers. The pioneering life is not the normal life, whatever some Americans may suppose. It is not, if we look for the meaning of European history. The lesson of each of the European cultures now extant is in this, that European opinion does not make too much of the intense practical enterprises, but is at pains to define rather narrowly the practical effort which is prerequisite to the reflective and aesthetic life. Boys are very well pleased to employ their muscles almost exclusively, but men prefer to exercise their minds. It is the European intention to live materially, along the inherited line of least resistance, in order to put the surplus of energy into the free life of the mind. This is engendered that famous or infamous European conservatism, which will appear stupid, necessarily, to men still fascinated by materialistic projects, men in a state of arrested adolescence, for instance, to some very large if indefinite fraction of the population of these United States. Perhaps England is being quickened or Americanized. Then, tant pis. I have in mind here the core of unadulterated Europeanism, with its self-sufficient, backward-looking, intensely provincial communities. The human life of English provinces long ago came to terms with nature, fixed its roots somewhere in the spaces between the rocks and in the shade of the trees, founded its comfortable institutions, secured its modest prosperity, and then willed the whole in perpetuity to the generations which should come after, in the ingenious confidence that it would afford them all the essential human satisfactions. For it is the character of a seasoned provincial life that it is realistic, or successfully adapted to its natural environment, and that as a consequence it is stable or hereditable. But it is the character of our urbanized, anti-provincial, progressive, and mobile American life that it is in a condition of eternal flux. Affections and long memories attach to the ancient bowers of life in the provinces, but they cannot attach to what is always changing. Americans, however, are somewhat averse to such affections for natural objects and to such memories. The southern states were settled, of course, by miscellaneous strains, but evidently the one which determined the peculiar tradition of the South was the one which came out of Europe most convinced of the virtues of establishment, contrasting with those strains which seem for the most part to have dominated the other sections, and which came out of Europe feeling rebellious toward all establishments. There are a good many faults to be found with the Old South, but hardly the fault of being intemperately addicted to work and to gross material prosperity. The South never conceded that the whole duty of man was to increase material production, or that the index to the degree of his culture was the volume of his material production. His business seemed to be rather to envelop both his work and his play with a leisure which permitted the activity of intelligence. On this assumption, the South pioneered her way to a sufficiently comfortable and rural sort of establishment, considered that an establishment was something stable, and proceeded to enjoy the fruits thereof. The arts of the section, such as they were not immensely passionate, creative, and romantic. They were the 18th century social arts of dress, conversation, manners, the table, the hunt, politics, oratory, the pulpit. These were arts of living, and not arts of escape. They were also community arts, in which every class of society could participate after its kind. The South took life easy, which is itself a tolerably comprehensive art. But so did other communities in 1850, I believe, and doubtless some others do so yet, in parts of New England, for example. If there are such communities, this is their token, that they are settled. Their citizens are comparatively satisfied with the life they have inherited, and are careful to look backward quite as much as they look forward. Before the Civil War, there must have been many such communities this side of the frontier. The difference between the North and the South was that the South was constituted by such communities and made solid, but solid is only a comparative term here. The South as a culture had more solidity than another section, but there were plenty of gaps in it. The most we can say is that the Southern establishment was completed in a good many of the Southern communities, and that this establishment was an active, formative influence on the spaces between, and on the frontier spaces outlying, which had not yet perfected their organization of the economic life. The old Southern life was, of course, not nearly so fine as some of the traditionalists like to believe. It did not offer serious competition among the world types against the glory that was Greece or the grandeur that was Rome. It hardly began to match the finish of the English or any other important European civilization. It is quite enough to say that it was a way of life which has been considered and authorized. The establishment had a sufficient economic base. It was meant to be stable rather than provisional. It had got beyond the pioneering stage. It provided leisure, and its benefits were already being enjoyed. It may as well be admitted that Southern society was not an institution of a very showy elegance, for the so called aristocrats were mostly homemade and countrified. Aristocracy is not a word which defines this social organization so well as squirearchy, which I borrow from a recent article by Mr. William Frierson in the Sewanee Review. And even the squires, and the other classes too, did not define themselves very strictly. They were loosely graduated social orders, not so fixed as in Europe. Their relations were personal and friendly. It was a kindly society, yet a realistic one, for it was a failure if it cannot be said that people, for the most part, were in their right places. Slavery was a feature monstrous enough in theory, but more often than not humane in practice, and it is impossible to believe that its abolition alone could have effected any great revolution in society. The fullness of life, as it was lived in the antebellum South by the different social orders, can be estimated today only by the application of some difficult sociological technique. It is my thesis that they were all committed to a form of leisure, and that their labor itself was leisurely. The only Southerners who went abroad to Washington and elsewhere and put themselves into the record were those from the top of the pyramid. They held their own with their American contemporaries. They were not intellectually as seasoned as good Europeans, but then the Southern culture had had no very long time to grow. As time is reckoned in these matters, it would have borne a better fruit eventually. They had a certain amount of learning, which was not as formidable as it might have been, but at least it was classical and humanistic learning, not highly scientific, and not widely scattered about over a variety of special studies. It seems important to reflect that the South, as a going society, would not have countenanced the innovation of an elective college curriculum. The first aim of such a society is to protect its social concept, and this means the ascendancy in education of that group of studies which has social significance. They used to be called the humanities before they were forbidden the use of so proud a term. The admission that one study is as important as another is a plea in spiritual bankruptcy, and it invites and produces just that ceaseless dissipation of human energies which now defines our intellectual Americanism. It pictures man as a creature without a center, without a substantial core of interests, and unable to give to his destiny any direction. In a true society, there are historical and philosophical principles which compose the staple of an educational requirement, leaving the physical sciences to shift somewhat for themselves. And beyond the learning prescribed for its lay leaders, it is logical for this society to give an educational preference to certain professions which are peculiarly committed to its defense. Such professions are the church, the bar, and the higher teaching profession. When they lose caste, society is in danger. But this is somewhat of a digression, for in 1860 there was not much difference between Northern and Southern ideals of education. Certainly there was less difference between Northern and Southern colleges than there was between North and South. The colleges tended to be conservative social instruments everywhere. Then the North and the South fought, and the consequences were disastrous to both. The Northern temper was one of jubilation and expansiveness, and now it was no longer shackled by the weight of the conservative Southern tradition. Industrialism, the latest form of pioneering, and the worst, presently overtook the North, and in due time has now produced our present American civilization. Poverty and pride overtook the South, poverty to bring her institutions into disrepute, and to sap continually at her courage, and a false pride to inspire a distaste for the thought of fresh pioneering projects, and to doom her to an increasing physical enfeeblement. It is only too easy to define the malignant meaning of industrialism. It is the contemporary form of pioneering, yet since it never consents to define its goal, it is a pioneering on principle and with an accelerating speed. Industrialism is a program under which men, using the latest scientific paraphernalia, sacrifice comfort, leisure, and the enjoyment of life to win Pyrrhic victories from nature on points of no strategic importance. Ruskin and Carlyle feared it nearly 100 years ago, and now it may be said that their fears have been realized partly in England and with almost fatal completeness in America. Industrialism is an insidious spirit, full of false promises and generally fatal to establishments, since, when it once gets into them for a little renovation, it proposes never again to leave them in peace. Industrialism is rightfully a menial of almost miraculous cunning, but no intelligence. It needs to be strongly governed, or it will destroy the economy of the household. Only a community of tough conservative habit can master it. The South did not become industrialized. She did not repair the damage to her old establishment either, and it was in part because she did not try hard enough. Hers is the case to cite when we would show how the good life depends on an adequate pioneering, and how the pioneering energy must be kept ready for call when the establishment needs overhauling. The Southern tradition came to look rather pitiable in its persistence when the 20th century had arrived, for the establishment was quite depreciated. Unregenerate Southerners were trying to live the good life on a shabby equipment, and they were grotesque in their effort to make an art of living when they were not decently making a living. In the country districts, great numbers of these broken down Southerners are still to be seen in patched blue jeans, sitting on ancestral fences, shotgun across their laps, and hound dog at their feet, surveying their unkept acres while they comment shrewdly on the ways of God. It is their defect that they have driven a too easy, an unmanly bargain with nature, and that their aestheticism is based on insufficient labor. And now the crisis in the South's decline has been reached. Industrialism has arrived in the South. Already, the local chambers of commerce exhibit the formidable data of Southern progress. A considerable party of Southern opinion, which might be called the New South Party, is well pleased with the recent industrial accomplishments of the section and eager for many more. Southerners of another school, who might be said to compose an Old South Party, are apprehensive lest the section become completely and uncritically devoted to the industrial ideal precisely as the other and dominant sections of the Union are devoted to it. But Reconstruction is actually underway, and it is an industrial Reconstruction. Tied politically and economically to the Union, her borders wholly violable, all the South now sees very well that she can restore her prosperity only within the competition of an industrial system. After the war, the Southern plantations were often broken up into small farms. These have yielded less and less of a living, and it is said that they will never yield a good living until once more they are integrated into large units. But these units will be industrial units, controlled by a board of directors or an executive rather than by a squire, worked with machinery, and manned not by farmers living at home, but by labor. Even so, they will not, according to Mr. Henry Ford, support the population that wants to live on them. In the off-seasons, the laborers will have to work in factories, which henceforth are to be counted as among the charming features of Southern landscape. The Southern problem is very complicated, but at its center is the farmer's problem, and this problem is simply the most acute version of that general agrarian problem which inspires the despair of many thoughtful Americans today. The agrarian discontent in America is deeply grounded in the love of the tiller for the soil, which is probably, I must confess, not peculiar to the Southern specimen, but one of the more ineradicable human attachments, be the tiller as progressive as he may. In proposing to wean men of this foolish attachment, industrialism sets itself against the most ancient and most humane of all the modes of human livelihood. Do Mr. Hoover and the distinguished thinkers at Washington see how essential is the mutual hatred between the industrialists and the farmers, and how mortal is their conflict? The gentlemen at Washington are mostly preaching and legislating to secure the fabulous blessings of industrial progress. They are on the industrial side. But though the industrialists have a doctrine which is monstrous, they themselves are no monsters, but forward lookers with very nice manners, and no American progressivist is against them. The farmers seem boorish and stubborn by comparison. American progressivism is against them in the fight, though their traditional status is still so strong that they are not too flagrantly antagonized. All the solutions recommended for their difficulty are really enticements held out to them to become a little more cooperative, more mechanical, more mobile, in short, a little more industrialized. But the farmer who is not a mere laborer, even the farmer of the comparatively new places like Iowa and Nebraska, is necessarily among the more stable and less progressive elements of society. He refuses to mobilize himself and become a unit in the industrial army because he does not approve of army life. I will use some terms which are hardly in his vernacular. He identifies himself with a spot of ground, and this ground carries a good deal of meaning. It defines itself for him as nature. He would till it, not too hurriedly and not too mechanically, to observe in it the contingency and the infinitude of nature. And so his life acquires its philosophical and even its cosmical consciousness. A man can contemplate and explore, respect and love an object as substantial as a farm or a native province. But he cannot contemplate, nor explore, respect, nor love a mere turnover, such as an assemblage of natural resources, a pile of money, a volume of produce, a market, or a credit system. It is into precisely these intangibles that industrialism would translate the farmer's farm. It means the dehumanization of his life. However that may be, the South, at last, looking defensively about her in all directions upon an industrial world, fingers the weapons of industrialism. There is one powerful voice in the South which, tired of a long status of disrepute, would see the South made at once into a section second to none in wealth, as that is statistically reckoned, and in progressiveness, as that might be estimated by the rapidity of the industrial turnover. This desire offends those who would still like to regard the South as, in the old sense, a home, but its expression is loud and insistent. The urban South, with its heavy importation of regular American ways and regular American citizens, has nearly capitulated to these novelties. It is the village South and the rural South which supply the resistance, and it is lucky for them that they represent a vast quantity of inertia. Will the Southern establishment, the most substantial exhibit on this continent of a society of the European and historic order, be completely crumbled by the powerful acid of the great progressive principle? Will there be no more looking backward, but only looking forward? Is our new world to be dedicated forever to the doctrine of newness? It is in the interests of America as a whole, as well as in the interests of the South, that these questions press for an answer. I will enter here the most important items of the situation as well as I can. Doubtless they will appear a little over-sharpened for the sake of exhibition. 1. The intention of Americans at large appears now to be what it was always in danger of becoming, an intention of being infinitely progressive. But this intention cannot permit of an established order of human existence, and of that leisure which conditions the life of intelligence and the arts. 2. The Old South, if it must be defined in a word, practiced the contrary and European philosophy of establishment as the foundation of the life of the spirit. The Antebellum Union possessed, to say the least, a wholesome variety of doctrine. 3. But the South was defeated by the Union on the battlefield with remarkable decisiveness, and the two consequences have been dire. The Southern tradition was physically impaired, and has ever since been unable to offer an attractive example of its philosophy in action, and the American progressive principle has developed into a pure industrialism without any check from a Southern minority whose voice ceased to make itself heard. 4. The further survival of the Southern tradition as a detached local remnant is now unlikely. It is agreed that the South must make contact again with the Union, and in adapting itself to the actual state of the Union, the Southern tradition will have to consent to a certain industrialization of its own. 5. The question at issue is whether the South will permit herself to be so industrialized as to lose entirely her historic identity, and to remove the last substantial barrier that has stood in the way of American progressivism, or will accept industrialization but with a very bad grace, and will manage to maintain a good deal of her traditional philosophy. The hope which is inherent in this situation is evident from the terms in which it is stated. The South must be industrialized, but to a certain extent, and in moderation. The program which now engages the Southern leaders is to see how the South may handle this fire without being badly burned. The South at last is to be physically reconstructed, but it will be fatal if the South should conceive it as her duty to be regenerated, her spirit reborn, with a totally different orientation towards life. And fortunately, the Southern program is not perfectly vague, but is capable of a certain definition. There are at least two lines along either of which an intelligent Southern policy may move in the right general direction, and it may even move back and forth between them and still advance. The first course would be for the Southern leaders to arouse the sectional feeling of the South to its highest pitch of excitement in defense of all the old ways that are threatened. It may seem rather ungrateful towards the industrialists to accept their generous services in such a churlish spirit. But if one thing is more certain than another, it is that these gentlemen will not be found standing by while they wait for human sympathy. They are already on the scene, and manifesting an inextinguishable enthusiasm for their role. The only attitude that needs artificial respiration is the resistant attitude of the natives. The resistance will be the fiercest and most effective if industrialism is represented to the Southern people as what it undoubtedly is for the most part a foreign invasion of Southern soil, which is capable of much more devastation than was wrought when Sherman marched to the sea. From this point of view, it will be a great gain if the present peaceful invasion will now and then forget itself by some indiscretion and be less peaceful. The native and the invader will be sure to come to an occasional clash, and that may offer the chance to revive ancient and almost forgotten animosities. It will be in order to proclaim to Southerners that the carpetbaggers are again in their midst. And it will be well to seize upon and advertise certain northern industrial communities as horrible examples of a way of life which Southerners traditionally detest, not failing to point out the human catastrophe which occurs when a southern village or rural community becomes the cheap labor of a miserable factory system. It will be doubtless a little bit harder to impress the people with the fact that the new so called industrial slavery not only fastens upon the poor, but blights the middle and better classes of society too. And to make this point, it may be necessary even to revive such a stale antiquity as the old Southern gentleman, and his scorn for the dollar chasers and the technical specialists. Such a policy as this would show decidedly a sense of what the Germans call realpolitik. It would be nasty and unscrupulous, but it would accomplish results. Its net result might be to give the South eventually a position in the Union analogous more or less to the position of Scotland under the British Crown, a section with a very local and peculiar culture that would nevertheless be secure and respected. And Southern traditionalists may take courage from the fact that it was Scottish stubbornness which obtained this position for Scotland. It did not come gratuitously. It was the consequence of an intense sectionalism that fought for a good many centuries before its fight was won. That is one policy, and though it is not the only one, it may be necessary to employ it with discretion and to bear in mind its Scottish analogue. But it is hardly handsome enough for the best Southerners. Its methods are too easily abused. It offers too much room for the professional demagogue, and one would only as a last resort like to have the South stake upon it her whole chance of survival. After all, the reconstruction may be undertaken with some imagination, and not necessarily after the formula of a literal restoration. It does not greatly matter to what extent the identical features of the old Southern establishment are restored. The important consideration is that there be an establishment for the sake of stability. The other course may not be so easily practicable, but it is certainly more idealistic and statesmanlike. That course is for the South to re enter the American political field with a determination and an address quite beyond anything she has exhibited during her half hearted national life of the last half a century. And this means specifically that she may pool her own stakes with the stakes of other minority groups in the Union, which are circumstanced similarly. There is in active American politics already, to start with, a very belligerent, if somewhat uninformed, Western agrarian party. Between this party and the South there is much community of interest. Both desire to defend home, stability of life, the practice of leisure, and the natural enemy of both is the insidious industrial system. There are also, scattered here and there, numerous elements with the same general attitude, which would have some power if united. The persons, and even communities, who are thoroughly tired of progressivism and its spurious benefits, and those who have recently acquired or miraculously, through the generations, preserved a European point of view. Sociologists, educators, artists, religionists, and ancient New England townships. The combination of these elements with the Western farmers and the old fashioned South would make a formidable bloc. The South is numerically much the most substantial of these three groups, but has done next to nothing to make the cause prevail by working inside the American political system. The unifying effective bond between these geographically diverse elements of public opinion will be the clean cut policy that the rural life of America must be defended and the world made safe for the farmers.